The night they came for Colton Brennan, he didn't run, he didn't shout, he didn't reach for the gun tucked beneath his tailored jacket. He set his coffee down, adjusted his cufflinks, looked the lead federal agent dead in the eye, and said, "I suppose I should call my lawyer. 37 years old, 6'2", a jaw carved from the same cold stone as the Boston harbor docks he controlled. Colton Brennan wasn't just wealthy. He was the kind of man whose name made prosecutors lose sleep and politicians return phone calls before the second ring. His organization moved millions through the ports every month, quiet, invisible, untouchable, until that morning. 14 FBI agents, battering rams. Handcuffs clicked shut in a restaurant he owned in South Boston while his espresso was still warm. The charges were enough to bury him for 25 years in a federal cell. But here's what nobody expected. The most dangerous man on the East Coast spent his first night in custody, curled in the corner of his cell, shaking, gasping for air, unable to see, unable to speak. The guards found him at 3 a.m, the man who'd made grown men tremble, trembling himself like a child afraid of the dark. And that's exactly what he was. Because Colton Brennan had been told his whole life that his mother died in a car accident when he was 7. He remembered almost nothing of her, just the faint scent of orange blossoms and a lullaby he wasn't sure was real. His father, the previous boss, raised him the only way he knew how. Dark rooms for hours to build discipline, silence during interrogations at 6 years old, and one rule above all others: Brennan men don't feel, they decide. Colton believed it. He built an empire on that belief. Then the federal prosecutor revealed his star witness, someone who'd been hidden inside the witness protection program for 30 years, someone who knew every secret the Brennan family had ever buried. When Colton's lawyer uncovered the name, the color drained from his face. The protected witness was his mother. She wasn't dead. She'd never been dead. And now the government wanted her to testify against her own son. That's when they sent her in. Finley Kavanagh, 28, clinical psychologist, assigned to evaluate the highest-profile federal inmate in the country. She wasn't what anyone expected either. Dark circles under her eyes, student loans she'd be paying off until 50, living alone in a Brooklyn walk-up with no photos on the walls and no one to call on holidays. Her father had died alone in a cheap hospital room at 3 a.m. during her senior year, and she'd arrived 7 minutes too late. She'd never forgiven herself for those 7 minutes. That's why she took the cases nobody wanted, the violent ones, the broken ones, the ones other doctors refused to touch. Their first session was a war. He sat across from her in handcuffs, posture perfect, eyes cold, every word calculated to manipulate and control. But Finley didn't bend. She called out every technique the moment he used it. "You're deflecting. You're testing how afraid I am. You're performing." He stopped. For the first time in his life, someone was looking straight through him without flinching. "You're not afraid of me," he said. It wasn't a question. "Being afraid of you wouldn't help me treat you." Silence. Then he tilted his head slightly, like he was seeing something he'd never seen before. And that was the beginning. Not of love, not yet, but of something far more dangerous. The slow, terrifying process of one human being actually seeing another. If this story already has you hooked, smash that like button so more people can find it. Share it with someone who loves a good twist. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now's the time. You won't want to miss what happens next. Now let's go back to the moment everything changed. The day Colton Brennan discovered that the mother he'd been mourning for 30 years was still alive, and she was about to either save him or destroy him forever. But that night, inside a federal cell in Brooklyn, everything Colton Brennan had ever built collapsed without anyone having to lay a hand on it. The fluorescent light on the ceiling flickered, then went out completely at midnight, exactly according to detention center procedure, and darkness fell over the cell like a giant hand pressing down on his chest. Colton sat on the iron bed, his back straight, both hands resting on his knees, trying to control his breathing the way he had always controlled everything in his life. But darkness didn't take orders from anyone. It wasn't afraid of him. It didn't need to know who he was. And in that darkness, something began to rise from the deepest place inside him, something he had buried since he was a 7-year-old boy standing in a dark room in his father's house in South Boston. His breath began to shorten. His heart beat faster, then faster still. until it was moving so quickly he couldn't separate one beat from the next. His hands trembled, not the trembling of a frightened man, but the trembling of a body betraying its own master. Colton tried to stand, but his knees couldn't hold him. He slid down onto the cold concrete floor, his back against the wall, and suddenly he was no longer in the cell. He was in the small, windowless room in the basement of the old house, where his father used to lock him every Saturday night to build what he called discipline. The boy, 5 years old, sat on the cold wooden floor, clutching his knees, counting every second in the darkness and trying not to cry, because if he cried, the clock would start all over again. That boy had never truly left that room. He had only learned how to pretend he had gotten out. And now, 30 years later, in another cell, another darkness, that boy woke up. Colton couldn't hear himself breathing. He couldn't feel his arms or legs. His eyes were open, but he saw nothing except thick darkness and shattered pieces of memory spinning around him. His father's voice echoing somewhere far away, the sound of the iron door closing, the damp, moldy smell of the basement wood, and the faint scent of orange blossoms that he didn't know belonged to whom. The guard found him at 3 o'clock in the morning during the rounds. Colton was curled up in the corner of the cell, drenched in sweat, eyes wide open, but he didn't react when the flashlight shone straight into his face. They called his name 3 times. No answer. They called for emergency medical help. When the doctor on duty arrived, Colton was still in that same position, both arms wrapped around his knees, his lips moving around words that made no sound. The doctor checked his pulse, his pupils, his reflexes, then wrote 4 words in the file that no one in Colton's underworld had ever imagined would be attached to his name. Requires intensive psychiatric evaluation. The next morning, that file was lying on the desk of the detention center's medical director. And from there, it began moving through the federal system until it reached the right desk, the desk of a psychologist in Brooklyn who was 28 years old, someone who had never heard the name Colton Brennan until that morning. 3 days after the collapse inside the cell, Neil Sheehan came to see Colton in the attorney visitation room of the Federal Detention Center. Neil was the kind of lawyer only the richest or the most dangerous men could hire. Gray, 3-piece suit, Patek Philippe watch, a face that never revealed emotion whether the news was good or bad. But that day, when he sat down across from Colton behind the sheet of glass, Neil looked different, not afraid. Cautious, in the way of a man about to deliver news he himself still didn't know how to handle. Colton sat straight, his face calm again, as though the panic from 3 nights earlier had never happened. He had spent 3 days setting each brick back into place on the wall the darkness had broken, and now that wall stood firmer than ever, at least from the outside. Neil opened his leather briefcase, placed a thick file on the table, and began speaking in a low, even voice that no one around them could hear. Bad news. Prosecutor Grant Mercer wasn't playing by the usual rules. Mercer was the kind of federal prosecutor who appeared on magazine covers, 50 years old, ambitious, sharp, and famous for never taking a case to trial unless he was certain he would win. This time, Mercer had everything: recordings, financial ledgers, internal testimony from at least 2 low-ranking members of the Brennan organization who had accepted plea deals in exchange for lighter sentences. But none of that was his strongest card. Mercer's strongest card was a witness. Neil slowed down at this part, choosing every word carefully. This witness had been in the Federal Witness Protection Program for 30 years. 30 years. Not 3, not 10, but 30. The identity had been sealed at the highest level of the Department of Justice. There was no name in any public record, not a single trace in any system an ordinary lawyer could touch. This person knew the structure of the Brennan organization from its roots, from before Colton ever took power, from the time when his father was still alive. Neil said he was doing everything he could to break through the sealed WITSEC file, but the federal system wasn't something that could be bought or threatened easily, and Mercer was clearly protecting this witness the way a man protected the final card on a poker table. Colton listened to all of it without saying a word. He didn't interrupt, didn't ask, didn't react. When Neil stopped, the visitation room was so quiet they could hear the fluorescent light buzzing on the ceiling. Then Colton opened his mouth, his voice low, cold, and slow enough that Neil had to lean forward to hear him clearly. Who? One single word. Neil looked straight into Colton's eyes, then shook his head. I don't know yet, but I'll find out. Colton didn't nod. He didn't answer. He only looked at Neil with the kind of gaze anyone who had ever worked for the Brennan organization understood very well. A gaze that said the answer wasn't an option, it was an order, and it needed to arrive before Colton had to go looking for it himself. That same morning, as Neil Sheehan left the detention center carrying Colton's unanswered question with him, more than an hour's drive away, Finley Kavanagh woke up in her fourth-floor walk-up studio apartment in Flatbush, Brooklyn. The alarm hadn't had time to ring, because she had opened her eyes 20 minutes earlier, lying there and staring at the ceiling, listening to the sound of pipes leaking inside the wall and the garbage truck grinding trash beneath her window. The apartment was so small that standing in the middle of the room, she could touch both the kitchen and the bed. No paintings on the walls, no houseplants, no family photographs. Only books stacked in piles on the floor and thick patient files on the old desk she had bought from a secondhand shop in Prospect Heights for $20. Finley made coffee with a kettle on the stove because she didn't have a coffee maker, then sat down to eat breakfast from a bowl of cheap cereal while scrolling through work emails on a laptop whose screen had gone slightly blurry in the left corner. The student loan bill sat right at the top of her inbox, as it did every month, reminding her that her doctorate in clinical psychology from Columbia was still chasing her with a debt she had calculated she would be paying until she was 50 if nothing changed. Nothing changed. Finley's life ran in a loop she had designed for herself. Wake up, work, come home, read files, sleep, then wake up again. No close friend calling on weekends. No boyfriend texting her good night. No one waiting for her at home. She had lived that way since her father died, and she saw no reason to change it. Her father, a plumber in Queens who worked 6 days a week to pay for his only daughter's education, had been diagnosed with pancreatic cancer when Finley was 21, at the beginning of her final year of college. He refused chemotherapy because he didn't have good enough insurance and didn't want more debt just to stretch his life by a few more months. He told Finley he was fine, that she should focus on school, that everything would be all right. He lied. One night in March, the hospital called at 2:47 in the morning. Finley drove from her Columbia dorm down to Queens in the rain, ran through the hospital corridor with her shoes not even tied, pushed open the door to his room, and saw the bed empty. Her father had died at 3 o'clock, 7 minutes before she arrived. 7 minutes. He died alone in a cheap hospital room at 3 o'clock in the morning, with no one holding his hand, no one saying a final word, no one sitting beside him so he would know he was loved. Finley never forgave herself for those 7 minutes. Not because she had arrived late, but because she had believed him when he said everything would be all right. She should have seen the pain behind the smile. She should have been there. From then on, Finley chose the path none of her colleagues wanted to take. She specialized in therapy for federal inmates, the most violent, unstable, dangerous cases, the patients other doctors marked in the file as uncooperative before passing them to someone else. When her colleagues asked why, she only answered that it was because no one else was willing to sit down with them. But the truth went deeper than that. Every patient she sat beside was one way of atoning for the 7 minutes she had lost. Every time she stayed when someone else walked away, it was another time she told her father she was sorry. And that morning, when an email from the medical director of the Metropolitan Federal Detention Center appeared on the laptop screen blurred at the left corner, asking her to take an urgent psychiatric evaluation case for a high-profile inmate named Colton Brennan, Finley had never heard his name before. She didn't know what he controlled. She didn't know the whole city had once feared him. She only knew the file said he had collapsed inside his cell at 3 o'clock in the morning, and no one else was willing to take the case. That was enough. The first therapy session after the initial evaluation took place on the following Monday, and Colton arrived with an entirely different strategy. He didn't confront her the way he had before. He stayed silent. He sat down in the chair, back straight, eyes fixed past Finley's shoulder on the wall behind her, and didn't say a single word for 45 minutes. Finley didn't speak either. She sat there, her pen resting on her notebook, waiting patiently in a silence most other doctors wouldn't have endured past 10 minutes. When the time was over, she only said, "See you Wednesday." Colton stood without answering. In the second session, he changed tactics. He began to speak, but not about himself. He asked Finley where she had studied, where she lived, how many patients she had. how much she was paid. The questions were designed to pull her out of the position of power in the conversation. The technique of a man used to controlling boardrooms, turning the person across from him into the one who had to answer instead of the one who asked. Finley recognized it immediately. She didn't answer, and she didn't seem irritated. She only said calmly, "You're trying to turn me from the doctor into the person being interrogated? It won't work." Colton looked at her for the first time that day, not with anger, with curiosity. In the third session, he tried charm. His voice lowered, his eyes softened, and he leaned forward, as though sharing a secret. "You know, you're the most interesting person I've met in here." Finley didn't move. And that's the third technique you've used in 3 sessions. Silence, control, then charm. I'm guessing the next session will be sarcasm. In the 4th session, exactly as she had predicted, Colton turned sarcastic. He asked how many years of schooling it took for her to sit there listening to criminals talk while being paid too little to buy a handbag. Finley wrote something in her notebook, then looked up. "You have 4 techniques, and you've used all of them. When you're ready to tell the truth, I'll still be sitting here." After that session, something changed. Not something large, not something obvious. But Finley noticed that Colton began arriving on time instead of making her wait 10 minutes the way he had during the first 4 sessions. Then, in the 3rd week, Finley read a detail in the guard's report, which she had requested to be updated daily. Colton woke at 3 o'clock in the morning every night, sweating, sitting up in bed, and then didn't sleep again until morning. Every night, without exception. 3 o'clock in the morning. In the next therapy session, Finley didn't ask about his childhood, didn't ask about the organization, didn't ask about his father. She only asked, "What do you dream about?" Colton answered at once, too quickly. "I don't dream." Finley gave a small nod. She knew he was lying. The guard's reports didn't lie, but she didn't push. She only said, "When you're ready to talk about the dream, I'll be here." Then she moved to another subject, and the session ended normally. But 2 weeks later, on an afternoon when the Brooklyn sky hung heavy and gray beyond the therapy room window, Colton did something Finley hadn't expected. He asked about her, not in the manipulative way he had during the 2nd session. This time, he seemed to truly want to know. "Your father is dead?" Finley's writing hand stopped. She looked at him, weighing for a split second the line between professional boundaries and human instinct. Then she answered, "Yes. Do you miss him?" "Every day." Silence stretched between them. Then Colton spoke, his voice smaller than any she had ever heard from him. So small she had to lean forward. "I don't remember my mother's face." It wasn't storytelling. It wasn't a strategy. It was a confession that had broken loose from a place where 30 years of walls had never allowed light to enter. Finley didn't overreact. She didn't tilt her head in pity. She didn't write in her notebook. She only sat there, looking at him, and let that sentence exist in the space between them, without trying to analyze it or heal it. Sometimes the most healing thing a doctor can do is nothing at all, except remain there. The therapy session ended 10 minutes later without either of them saying another word. That night, Finley sat at the desk in her Flatbush apartment, opened her laptop, and began writing the progress report for Colton Brennan's file. But her hand trembled. Not much, just enough for her to notice. She placed her hand flat on the desk, looked at it, and understood exactly what was happening. She was beginning to see Colton Brennan not as a patient, but as a human being. And in her profession, that was a boundary that, once crossed, had no road back. While Finley was wrestling with her own boundary, Neil Sheehan was breaking through another one. 10 days after the meeting in the visitation room, Neil found what he needed, not through the official legal system, but through a senior clerk at the Department of Justice in Washington. Someone Neil had maintained a connection with for 15 years, for exactly this kind of situation. No money, no threats. Just a phone call at 10 o'clock at night, a name whispered over the line, and a WITSEC file sealed for 30 years suddenly had a crack wide enough for light to slip through. Neil drove from Manhattan to the Federal Detention Center in Brooklyn the very next morning. He didn't call ahead, didn't schedule an appointment. He simply appeared, demanded an urgent meeting with Colton, and sat waiting in the attorney visitation room with his face 2 shades paler than usual. When Colton was let in, he knew at once that something was different. Neil didn't open his leather briefcase, didn't place a file on the table. He only sat there, hands clasped together on the tabletop, and looked at Colton with an expression Colton had never seen on Neil. In the 12 years Neil had been his lawyer, it was the look of a man who didn't know where to begin. Neil drew a breath and spoke. Mercer's witness wasn't a former member of the organization, wasn't an old enemy, wasn't anyone Colton had ever met or ever ordered dealt with. The witness was Ruth Brennan. Colton didn't react. The name hung in the air between them, like a bullet that hadn't yet reached its target. Ruth Brennan, his mother's name. The woman he had been told had died in a car accident 30 years earlier, when he was only 7. Neil continued, his voice low and even, as though he were reading testimony in court, rather than speaking to a living, breathing human being. She wasn't dead. She had never been dead. 30 years earlier, she had testified against Patrick Brennan, her husband, Colton's father, in a sealed federal trial. After that, she had been placed in the Witness Protection Program, her identity erased, and she disappeared. For 30 years, she had lived under the name Ruth Calloway in a small town in Montana. And now Mercer was pulling her back, this time to testify against her own son. Neil stopped, waiting for a reaction. He had prepared for rage. Prepared for Colton to slam the table, stand up, shout, threaten, do anything a crime boss would do when he discovered that the foundation of his entire life was a lie. But Colton did none of those things. He sat still, his eyes lowered to the metal tabletop, motionless. Then he laughed. The laugh was very small, very faint, starting deep in his chest and slipping out through barely parted lips without fully becoming a sound. It wasn't the laugh of a man who found something funny. It was the laugh of a man who had just realized that the cruelest joke in the world had been told to him for 30 years, and he was the only one who hadn't known. Neil went cold. In 12 years of working for Colton, he had watched this man make decisions involving millions of dollars and human lives without breaking a sweat. But this laugh made Neil want to stand up and walk out of the room. Colton laughed for a few more seconds, then stopped abruptly, as if someone had turned a key. His face was empty. His eyes looked at Neil but didn't see Neil. "Get out," Colton said. 2 words, his voice flat. Neil didn't need to hear it twice. He gathered his leather briefcase and left the room without looking back. Outside, he stopped in the hallway, leaned back against the wall, and for the first time in his career, wondered whether his client would survive this, not legally, but as a man. That night, the collapse came for the second time, but this time it wasn't like the panic attack from the week before. The first time, Colton had trembled and lost control of his body. This time, he lost control of his mind. The guard, making rounds at 2 o'clock in the morning, heard a voice coming from Colton's cell. He was talking, his voice small and even, as though he were answering someone. But there was only one person in the cell. The guard shone his flashlight through the bars and saw Colton sitting on the floor, eyes open, staring into the empty corner of the room, saying sentences the guard couldn't fully understand, though he caught a few words repeated again and again. "I'm all right. I'm not crying. I'm all right." The words of the 7-year-old boy who had once sat in the dark room of his father's house, telling himself that everything would pass, that his mother would come back, that someone would open the door. No one opened the door for 30 years. And now, when the door finally swung open, what waited behind it wasn't light, but the truth that the only person he thought had abandoned him through death had actually abandoned him by choice. The guards called medical help for the second time in less than a month. The doctor on duty wrote in the file, "Acute dissociative episode, patient disconnected from present reality, requires urgent psychological evaluation by the specialist currently assigned." The next morning, that file was on Finley Kavanaugh's phone before she had even finished making her cup of coffee on the stove. More than 3,200 kilometers west of Brooklyn, in a small town in Montana with a population of fewer than 4,000 people, a 58-year-old woman named Ruth Calloway was kneeling in the backyard, both hands digging into the soil as she planted lavender beneath the bright April morning sun. The house was small and one-story, with a white wooden fence and a porch that held an old swing chair she had bought at a second-hand market when she first moved there. She lived alone. No husband, no children, no relatives. The neighbors knew her as the gentle woman who volunteered at the public library every Tuesday and Thursday, helping children choose books and reading stories to the kindergarten class during lunch break. No one knew who she truly was. No one knew her real name. And no one knew that every night, before going to bed, she opened the old tin box hidden beneath her bed, took out a small, faded photograph of a 7-year-old boy with a round face and brown eyes, smiling at the camera, and looked at it until her vision blurred. Once a month, Agent Perry Walsh came to visit. He drove an unmarked black sedan, parked in front of her house, and brought coffee and pastries from the only bakery in town. Officially, it was a routine security check under WITSEC procedure. But in truth, Perry Walsh had protected Ruth for 30 years, longer than any witness case in his career, and he regarded her as family. He was the only person in the world who knew both parts of Ruth's life, the part before she disappeared and the part after. And he was the man who had called her yesterday morning to tell her that Prosecutor Grant Mercer wanted her to testify in court again. Ruth wasn't surprised. She had been waiting for that call for a long time, ever since she read Colton Brennan's name on the front page of the Boston Globe online edition 3 weeks earlier, with a headline about the largest arrest targeting organized crime on the East Coast in 10 years. She read the article 3 times. Then she turned off the computer, went out to the garden, knelt in the dirt, and cried until her knees were soaked with dew. 30 years earlier, Ruth wasn't Ruth Calloway. She was Ruth Brennan, 28 years old, the wife of Patrick Brennan, one of the most dangerous organized crime bosses in Boston. She had met Patrick when she was young, when he still hid half his darkness behind a charming smile and promises of a life that a middle-class girl from Dorchester had never dared dream of. She became pregnant with Colton when she was 21, and for the first few years, she truly believed Patrick would be a good father. He loved Colton. That was something she never doubted. But Patrick Brennan's love was a dangerous kind of love, the kind that wanted to turn his son into a perfect version of himself. And perfect in Patrick's world meant without fear, without emotion, without weakness. When Colton was 5, Patrick began what he called training. The small windowless room in the basement, the door locked from the outside, total darkness. Colton was taken there every Saturday night. The only rule was this: if he cried, the time started over from the beginning. The first time Ruth found out, she ran down to the basement and heard her son crying behind the door. She pounded on it. Patrick stood behind her, calm, and said this was the only way Colton would survive in this world. She begged him to stop. He refused. When Colton was 6, Patrick escalated it. He made the boy sit on a high chair in a sealed room and witness interrogations, grown men questioned by Patrick's people. Colton didn't understand what was happening. He only knew that his father wanted him to watch and not close his eyes. Ruth knew that if she didn't do something, Colton would lose the human part of himself before he was old enough to enter 2nd grade. She couldn't divorce him because Patrick would never let her take Colton away. She couldn't call the police because half of the Boston police were accepting envelopes from her husband. There was only one path left. She secretly contacted the FBI through a federal hotline one night while Patrick was away. From then on, for 2 years, Ruth Brennan became an informant planted deep inside her own husband's organization. She copied financial ledgers while Patrick slept. She recorded phone calls using equipment provided by the FBI, hidden in her coat pocket whenever guests came to the house. She walked in and out of rooms where no one suspected the boss's wife, and she recorded everything. 2 years sleeping beside the man she was betraying. 2 years fearing that every goodnight kiss could be the last one if he found out. When there was enough evidence, the FBI brought the case to a sealed federal trial. Ruth testified. Patrick was convicted, but before the sentence took effect, Patrick was shot dead in an internal war between factions inside the organization. Men who had once been loyal turning their backs when they learned he had been betrayed by his wife, seeing it as a sign of weakness that couldn't be forgiven. Ruth was placed in WITSEC immediately afterward. New identity, new location, new life. And one single condition the FBI made clear had no exceptions. She wasn't allowed to contact Colton. No letters, no phone calls, no messages, not one trace. Because any thread connecting Ruth to her son would become a thread leading his enemies to her and to him. Ruth agreed, not because she wanted to, but because she believed that staying away from her son was the only way for him to live. She left Boston on a winter night without being allowed to look back, carrying only the small photograph of the 7-year-old boy hidden in her coat pocket. and a hollow place in her chest that 30 years of planting lavender in Montana had never been able to fill. After the dissociative episode that night, Finley was called to the detention center for an emergency visit early the next morning. She read the report from the doctor on duty on the way there, and when she stepped into the therapy room, she knew she couldn't keep treating Colton Brennan while holding only half the truth. She needed to know what had happened to his mother, not out of curiosity, but because the dissociative episode the night before showed that Colton's core wound was there, in the woman he believed had died, and if Finley didn't understand the wound, she couldn't heal it. Finley filed an official request with the detention center's medical director, asking for access to the patient's family background file for the purpose of psychological treatment. Federal procedure allowed this in cases where the patient was at risk of self-harm, and after the dissociative episode, Colton qualified. The file was sent to her 3 days later, not the full WITSEC file, but the summary the Department of Justice permitted to be shared with authorized medical staff. But that summary was enough. Finley read it in her Flatbush apartment, sitting on the floor because the only chair she owned was piled high with other patient files. And when she finished reading, she set the papers down on the floor, looked out the window where the Brooklyn streetlights spilled across the ceiling, and for the first time in her career, she didn't know what she should do. The file made it clear. Ruth Brennan hadn't abandoned her son. She had destroyed her own life to save him from becoming the thing her husband was shaping him into. She had gathered evidence for 2 years from inside the heart of the organization, testified, then disappeared into WITSEC under the condition that she never contact Colton again. Everything she had done, from beginning to end, had been for the 7-year-old boy she had left behind in Boston 30 years earlier. Finley faced the greatest ethical decision she had encountered since entering the profession. Tell Colton the truth or stay silent. If she told him, she would violate the boundary between therapy and personal intervention. If she didn't, she would let her patient continue building his entire identity on the foundation of a lie someone had told him when he was too young to question it. She chose to tell him. In that day's therapy session, Finley didn't begin with a question. She began with silence, then told Colton that she had read the file related to his mother, and that what she knew would change everything he had ever believed. Then she told him, piece by piece, clearly, without adding or taking anything away. Ruth hadn't died. Ruth had testified against Patrick to save Colton. Ruth had entered WITSEC because it was the only way to protect both mother and son. And for 30 years, she had lived alone in Montana under another name, forbidden to watch her son grow up. Colton listened without interrupting. His face held no expression, the same way it had when Neil gave him the news the day before. But this time, Finley saw what Neil hadn't seen. She saw his hands clench the edge of the chair until his knuckles turned white. She saw his jaw tighten, then loosen, then tighten again. And she saw his eyes, not the cold eyes of a crime boss, but the eyes of the 7-year-old boy who had just heard someone say that his mother hadn't died. She just hadn't been allowed to come back. When Finley stopped speaking, she waited for the anger. But Colton wasn't angry at his mother. He didn't say a single word about Ruth. Instead, he asked one question, his voice trembling slightly, yet still sharp with cold control. Did Warren know? Finley didn't understand at once. Warren Doyle, my uncle, the man who raised me after my father died. Did he know my mother was alive? Finley had no answer, but her silence was answer enough. Colton understood. Warren knew. His uncle, the man who had held the 7-year-old boy after his father was killed, the man who told him he still had an uncle, that his uncle would never leave him, that man had looked straight into the eyes of an orphaned child for 30 years and lied that his mother was dead. Rage surged through Colton so violently that Finley could see the veins standing out on his neck. But then the rage couldn't hold for long. It shifted into something deeper, heavier, something Finley, with her sharp clinical instincts, recognized immediately. Pain. Not the pain of being betrayed, the pain of realization. His mother had destroyed her life to keep him from becoming his father's weapon, and he had become exactly that. Everything she had sacrificed, the 2 years undercover, the trial, the 30 years of loneliness in Montana, all of it had been so he wouldn't step onto the path of crime. And he hadn't just stepped onto it. He had become the boss of that very road. Colton bowed his head. Both hands covered his face. He didn't cry, but his shoulders shook. The therapy room stayed silent for a very long time. Then he lifted his head, his eyes red, his voice hoarse but clear with every word. "I want to see her." After that session, everything between Colton and Finley changed in a way neither of them had planned, and neither of them could stop. Colton no longer built walls. No more strategic silence. No more sarcasm. No more charm. No more controlling the conversation. He came to therapy, and he told her things. Not in the way of someone trying to heal, but in the way of a door that had been opened too long and could no longer be closed. He told her about the dark room in the basement of the old house in South Boston. He told her that when he was 6, his father began the training more often, not just on Saturday nights, but any time Patrick decided Colton had shown weakness. Once, Colton cried because the neighbor's dog died, and Patrick took him down to the basement right then, in the middle of the day, and didn't open the door until night fell. Colton sat in the blackness, clutching his knees, counting from 1 to 1,000, and then starting over, because counting was the only way the 6-year-old boy knew to keep his mind from breaking into pieces. He wasn't allowed to cry. If he cried, the clock started over. If he called for his mother, the clock started over. If he pounded on the door, the clock started over. The only way out was to sit still, completely still, until his father decided it had been enough. Colton said he didn't remember which time had been the last time he cried. He only remembered that at some point, the tears stopped and never came back. Not because he had become stronger, but because the part of him that knew how to cry had died in that room. Then he told her about the first time he witnessed an interrogation when he was 6. His father placed him on a high chair in a sealed room and told him to look straight ahead, not to close his eyes, not to turn away. A man was tied to the chair across from him, his face bruised, trembling, begging. Colton didn't understand who the man was or what he had done. He only understood that his father wanted him to watch, and if he closed his eyes, there would be consequences. The 7-year-old boy sat there, eyes open, both hands gripping the arms of the chair, and for the first time, learned the lesson his father wanted to teach him. Power belonged to the person who didn't look away. Finley listened to all of it, without interrupting. She didn't write in her notebook, didn't give a professional nod, didn't tilt her head in sympathy. She only sat there, looked at him, and let him speak until he stopped on his own. She didn't judge, didn't look afraid of what he told her, didn't look at him with pity, and most importantly, she didn't leave. In Colton's life, people either feared him, wanted something from him, or pretended not to see the darkness inside him. Finley was the first person who looked straight into that darkness, saw it with complete clarity, and still remained seated in her chair. Then, one afternoon, after Colton finished speaking and the therapy room sank into silence, he asked her something he had never asked anyone, not as a strategy, not because he wanted control, but because he truly wanted to know, "Why did you choose this profession?" Finley was silent for a few seconds. She looked down at her hands, then looked up. And for the first time in this doctor and patient relationship, she allowed herself not to be a doctor. "I lost my dad to cancer during my senior year. The night he passed, I drove through the rain as fast as I could, but when I pushed the door open, his bed was already empty. I was 7 minutes too late." She stopped. "He died with no one holding his hand, no one telling him he was loved, no one sitting beside him." Silence. After that, I swore I'd never let anyone die or suffer without someone beside them. That's why I'm here. Colton looked at her, looked for a long time. Looked at her in a way he hadn't looked at anyone since he was the 7-year-old boy staring into the empty space where his mother used to stand. Then he spoke, his voice low and slow. "You're sitting beside a man who's going to die in prison." Finley didn't blink. "Then I'm here." The therapy room fell silent. The fluorescent light buzzed on the ceiling. The surveillance camera recorded 2 people sitting across from each other at the metal table bolted to the floor, neither of them saying another word, but both of them knowing that what had just happened in this room wasn't in any therapy file, wasn't in any textbook she had studied at Columbia, and wasn't within any professional boundary she had once sworn she would never cross. She had crossed it. And the most frightening part wasn't that she had crossed it. It was that she didn't want to go back. Colton wanted to see his mother, but Finley knew it couldn't happen right away. Ruth was still in WITSEC, Colton was still in custody, and between them stood 30 years of silence, and a federal case that had placed them on opposite sides of the battlefield. But Finley could take the first step. She filed a petition with the federal court, explaining that Colton Brennan's psychological treatment required her to meet directly with the family member connected to the origin of the patient's psychological trauma. The petition was accompanied by a detailed medical report on the 2 collapses inside the detention center, a diagnosis of complex PTSD, and an assessment stating that the patient was at risk of self-harm if he didn't receive the right kind of intervention. The court approved it after 5 days, on the condition that the meeting take place at a location designated by the FBI and that the WITSEC agent in charge remain present the entire time. The meeting was arranged in a small room inside the federal building in Helena, Montana, about 40 minutes by car from the town where Ruth lived. Perry Walsh brought Ruth there. When Finley stepped into the room, Ruth was already seated, both hands placed on the table, her back straight, her face calm, but her eyes watchful in the way of someone who had spent 30 years always prepared for everything to fall apart at any moment. Ruth looked Finley up and down, a young woman, thin, dark circles beneath her eyes, hair tied back in haste, old coat. Not at all like anyone Ruth had imagined the federal system would send. Perry Walsh sat in the corner of the room, silent, observing. Finley sat down, didn't open a file, didn't turn on a recorder. She looked at Ruth and spoke directly, without circling around, without a long introduction. "Your son is afraid of the dark. Do you know why?" Ruth froze. Not the way someone freezes because the question surprises them, but the way someone freezes after hearing confirmation of the thing she had feared for 30 years, but had never dared to ask. Her eyes widened, then closed, then opened again, and when they opened, tears were already falling. Patrick locked him in the dark room. Her voice trembled. It wasn't a question. It was the confirmation of what she had suspected since the day she left. The thing she had begged Patrick to stop when she was still there. The thing she had believed at least wouldn't continue after Patrick was convicted. But she had forgotten that Patrick died when Colton was only 7, and after that, Warren Doyle took over. She didn't know whether Warren had continued it or not. She wasn't allowed to know. Finley gave a small nod. "From the time he was 5 until he was 7, while you were still there, and possibly after that as well." Ruth lowered her face toward the table. Her shoulders shook. Perry Walsh watched from the corner, wearing the face of a man who had seen Ruth live for 30 years with composure and was now watching her break. Finley didn't touch Ruth, didn't comfort her. She only sat there and waited, the same way she waited for Colton in the therapy room, because she knew that sometimes the only thing to do was give pain enough space to exist. When Ruth lifted her head, her eyes were red, but her voice had grown steadier, and she began to speak. Not to answer the question, to tell the story. She said that for 30 years, she had followed Colton through every scrap of news she could find. At first, it was difficult, because Colton was still young and his name didn't appear in the papers. But when he grew older and began appearing in the world his father had left behind, his name started turning up in places Ruth wished it never had. She read every article. She kept every stolen photograph from parties or court hearings where he sat in the back row. She knew when he bought his first port, when he opened the front restaurant in South Boston, when his name was first mentioned in an FBI file that Perry Walsh accidentally left visible during one visit. She knew everything about her son that a stranger could know, and nothing that a mother needed to know. She didn't know what he liked to eat, didn't know what his voice sounded like when he laughed, didn't know whether he remembered her or had forgotten her completely. 30 years of watching from a distance, and every piece of news was another knife cut, because every line confirmed that Colton had become the very thing she had destroyed her life to prevent. Finley sat and listened for 3 hours. Ruth spoke, and she listened. No therapy techniques, no professional boundaries. Just 2 women sitting in a small room in Helena, Montana, one 28 years old and the other 58, both carrying wounds left by the men in their lives, both trying to save the same man without knowing the other was doing the same. When Finley stood to leave, Ruth took her hand. She said nothing, just held it, and Finley held hers back. In that moment, between 2 women who had never met before that day, there was an understanding that didn't need words, the understanding of people who loved someone deeply enough to accept being wounded because of it. While Finley flew back to Brooklyn with a heart heavier than when she had left, And while Colton counted each day inside his cell waiting to see his mother, the world outside the prison didn't stop. The Brennan organization still operated, still moved goods through the port, still collected money from its networks, still paid dozens of people whose livelihoods depended on the machine Colton had built. And the man who sat in Colton's chair while he was detained was Boyd Hackett, 40 years old, the right-hand man Colton had trusted most for the past 8 years. Boyd was the kind of man born to stand second. He was smart enough to run things, but he never had enough vision or strategic cruelty to stand at the top. At least that was what Colton believed. But power changes people in ways no one can predict, not even the person being changed. For the first 3 weeks, Boyd held temporary control. He did exactly what Colton instructed through Neil Sheehan. Keep every operation low. Don't expand. Don't draw attention. Wait for the case to end. But by the 4th week, Boyd began making decisions Colton hadn't allowed. A private deal with a partner in Providence. A new shipping line through the port of Newark that bypassed every review channel Colton had put in place. Money began flowing into accounts only Boyd knew about. He didn't plan to betray him. Power itself was the plan. It whispered in Boyd's ear every day that he was doing better than Colton, that the organization ran more smoothly without the boss sitting at the top giving orders, and that maybe Colton didn't need to come back. Then word of the WITSEC witness reached Boyd. Not from Neil Sheehan, but from his own source inside the court system. Boyd knew the witness was Ruth Brennan, and Boyd knew the thing that made the blood in his body turn cold. Ruth didn't only know about the organization during Patrick's time. She knew the structure of the organization from its roots, and if she spoke, if she testified to everything she knew combined with what the FBI had gathered over the past 30 years, then Colton wouldn't be the only one going to prison. Boyd would go to prison too. The private deals, the new routes, the hidden accounts, all of it would be exposed if the FBI had a full map of how the Brennan organization worked. Ruth was that map. Boyd wasn't the kind of man who got his own hands dirty. He was the kind who gave the order. He began arranging things, contacting people Colton would never have used, men outside the organization who were willing to do anything for the right amount of money. The target: silence Ruth Brennan before she stepped into the courtroom, permanently. But Boyd forgot one person: Warren Doyle, 62 years old, Patrick's younger half-brother, Colton's uncle, the old man who had sat quietly in the dark for 30 years, keeping the secret and raising his nephew on a lie. Warren no longer ran things directly, but his eyes and ears were still everywhere. And when he heard from an old source that Boyd was looking for someone for a job in Montana, he understood at once. Warren came to the Federal Detention Center in Brooklyn on a Friday afternoon, asking to see Colton as a family member. The visitation room. 2 men sat facing each other through the falta. Colton looked at his uncle with a gaze Warren had never seen in all the 30 years he had raised him. Not anger, not coldness, but the disappointment of a man who had just discovered that the foundation of his entire life had been built on sand. "You knew," Colton said. Not a question, a statement. Warren didn't deny it. He didn't look away. "I knew. 30 years. 30 years. You watched me cry for my mother when I was 12. You held me. You told me she was gone, and I still had you. You lied straight to a child's face." Warren swallowed. "I thought it was the way to protect you." Colton leaned toward the glass, his voice so low, it was almost a whisper, but every word was sharp as a blade. "Protect me? You raised me on a lie, taught me with violence, put me in the chair my father left behind, and called that protection? You turned me into a monster and called that protection?" Warren didn't answer. Because there was nothing to answer. Every excuse he had prepared for 30 years shattered in front of that sentence. The silence stretched. Then Warren spoke, his voice hoarse. "Boyd wants to kill Ruth." Colton froze. His entire body stopped, from his breathing to his heartbeat to his eyes, as if someone had pressed pause on a machine running at full speed. "You have to decide, Colt. Even in prison, you're still the boss. Does Boyd answer to you, or do you let him decide on his own?" Colton looked at Warren, looked at the man who had lied to him his whole life, the man he wanted never to see again, but also the man sitting here, telling him the truth, choosing a side when it mattered most. "Protect her," Colton said. His voice didn't shake, didn't hesitate, by any means. Warren nodded slowly. Then he stood, put on his coat, and walked out of the visitation room without looking back. He had lied to his nephew for 30 years. He couldn't fix that. But he could choose rightly once, and this time he chose Colton's side, not the organization's side, not Boyd's side, not the side of the old lie, but the side of the nephew he had failed. The nephew now sitting in prison and asking him, for the first time, to do the right thing. That night, Finley received a call from the detention center. Not during therapy hours, not through an official channel, but a call from the inmate phone line, the kind of 15-minute call that was recorded and monitored, the kind every federal inmate was allowed to make once a day. Colton had used his only call of the day to call her. Not Neil Sheehan, not Warren, not anyone in the network he had built over 15 years. Her. Finley stood in the small kitchen in Flatbush, the phone pressed to her ear, listening to Colton's voice through the static-filled federal line. His voice didn't sound the way it did in the therapy room. Not cold, not controlled, not the voice of a crime boss or a patient. It was the voice of a man who was afraid. And Finley knew that Colton Brennan, allowing someone to hear his fear, was something that had never happened before. "They'll murder my mother." He said it directly. No opening. No explanation. 4 words, then silence, waiting for her to take them in. Finley gripped the edge of the kitchen table. "Who?" "Boyd Hackett. My man. Or he used to be." He spoke quickly, knowing 15 minutes left, no room for circling around. Boyd was trying to silence Ruth before the trial. Warren had confirmed it. Colton had ordered Warren to protect her, but from inside prison he couldn't control everything, and he didn't trust that Warren alone could stop Boyd, while Boyd held the entire machine outside. Then he said the sentence Finley knew would change everything. "You're the only person outside I trust." Silence stretched over the line. Finley heard the detention center clock counting down the minutes left in the call. She understood exactly what he was asking her to do. Not write a report, not provide therapy. He was asking her to step out of the role of doctor and into his world. A world where every boundary she had ever kept, professional, legal, moral, personal safety, would blur past the point of repair. If she helped him, she wouldn't be his therapist anymore. She would be an accomplice, or at least someone concealing information related to a plot to murder a federal witness. Her license, her career, her freedom, all of it could be lost. She should have said no. Every rule she had ever learned, every boundary she had sworn to keep, every lecture she had heard at Columbia about professional distance from patients, all of it screamed inside her head to hang up, write a report, turn the matter over to the FBI, and step away. But Finley didn't hear those screams. She only heard Colton's voice through the static, and in that voice, she heard something no detention center recording could capture. The voice of the 7-year-old boy asking someone for help for the first time in his life. That boy had never asked anyone, had never trusted anyone enough to ask. And now, 30 years later, he was asking her. Finley closed her eyes, drew a breath, then opened them. "Tell me what to do." 2 days after that phone call, Finley flew back to Montana. This time, not as a federal psychologist. This time, she came as a woman who had chosen to step across the boundary and no longer had a road back. Perry Walsh picked her up at the Helena airport, his face more serious than it had been in any of their previous meetings, and drove straight to the safe house where Ruth was staying temporarily while waiting for the trial. When the 3 of them sat around the small kitchen table, Finley stated the situation plainly, without hiding anything. Boyd Hackett was planning to silence Ruth before she appeared in court. Colton knew and had ordered protection from inside prison, but Boyd controlled the entire machine outside, and time wasn't on their side. Ruth listened, stayed silent for a long while, then asked only one question. "If I go to court and testify exactly the way Mercer wants, my son goes to prison for 25 years. If I don't go to court, Boyd kills me. Is there another way?" Finley had thought about that question for the entire flight. There was a way, not perfect, not clean, but it was the only way all 3 of them could survive. Ruth would still go to court. She would still testify. But the direction of her testimony would change. Instead of focusing on Colton the way Mercer expected, Ruth would testify about the foundational blueprint of the Brennan organization, explaining how its traditional shadow structure, historically allowed an operational manager, to run illicit activities independently of the top boss. By linking her deep knowledge of these systemic roots with the recent encryption keys and files the FBI had seized from Boyd, she could help the defense unmask Boyd Hackett as the actual mastermind, leveraging that old infrastructure for the violence and expansion over the past 10 years. Colton was guilty. No one denied that. But the degree of guilt and the true role within the violent machinery were two different things, and Ruth could prove that difference. At the same time, Finley would submit an expert psychological report to the court. Not a defense report, but an objective clinical report on Colton's complex PTSD, attachment disorder, and clear evidence that his extreme behavior was the direct result of violent psychological conditioning from childhood. This report wouldn't make Colton innocent, but it would change the way the jury saw him, from a cold-blooded boss into the product of generational violence. Perry Walsh listened to the entire plan in silence. He wasn't part of the Brennan organization. He was an FBI agent. He had no obligation to help Colton, but he had protected Ruth for 30 years, and he knew that if Boyd reached Ruth before the trial, everything she had sacrificed for 30 years would become meaningless. Walsh nodded. He would offer quiet support, not by breaking federal procedure, but by making sure Ruth's security was raised to the highest level, and by not interfering with Ruth's decision to change the direction of her testimony, because legally, a witness had the right to tell the truth in the way they chose, and Mercer couldn't force her to say otherwise. The three of them left the safe house that night with a shared plan, but they didn't know Boyd already knew. Not the details, but enough. One of Boyd's sources inside the court system told him that Colton's psychologist had flown to Montana twice within 2 weeks, and that wasn't normal behavior for someone who was only writing a therapy report. Boyd understood at once. The doctor wasn't only treating Colton, she was helping him. The night Finley flew back to Brooklyn, her phone received a message from an unknown number. No signature. Only 4 words sent through a channel Colton would have recognized immediately if he had seen it. Your pretty doctor. Dark walk home. Finley read the message on the subway back to Flatbush. Her hands went cold. Her heart beat fast. But she didn't panic. She had sat across from the most dangerous man on the East Coast for weeks without blinking, and she wouldn't allow an anonymous message to knock her down. But when she came up above ground at the Flatbush Avenue station and began walking home, she noticed a black sedan parked at the end of the street, one she had never seen before. She turned left. The car started. She turned right. The car followed. 4 turns. The same car. Finley took out her phone and called Perry Walsh. Walsh answered on the second ring. 15 minutes later, an unmarked SUV pulled up beside Finley at the corner. The door opened, and Walsh said through the phone, "Get in. Don't go home tonight." From that night on, Finley lived under unofficial protection, half FBI through Walsh, half Warren Doyle's people under Colton's orders from prison. 2 opposing worlds, the federal world and the underworld, working together for one purpose only: keeping the 2 women Colton cared about most in the world alive until the day of the trial. Meanwhile, Warren began isolating Boyd from inside the organization in the only way the underworld understood. He met privately with each major partner, each loyal subordinate, and let them know that Boyd was skimming, diverting money into private accounts, betraying the very boss he had sworn loyalty to. In their world, losing money was a minor sin, but losing trust was a death sentence. One by one, they turned their backs on Boyd. The partner in Providence stopped answering the phone. The Newark route closed. Boyd's people began refusing orders. He was stripped down slowly, one layer at a time, until all that remained was a desperate man with power crumbling in his hands. And desperate men, consumed by paranoia when left with no loyal foot soldiers to command, break their own rules. Blinded by rage and total isolation, Boyd drove to Montana himself, alone, carrying a handgun hidden in the trunk. He didn't know exactly where Ruth was, but he knew enough to narrow the search, and he believed he could finish the job before anyone had time to react. He was wrong. The FBI had been tracking Boyd's every move since Walsh raised Ruth's security level. When Boyd parked less than 2 blocks from the witness protection area, 3 black SUVs blocked him from the front and behind. Federal agents pulled him out of the car, found the gun in the trunk, and handcuffed him on the sidewalk of a small Montana town whose name he didn't even know. Attempted murder of a federal witness. a sentence heavier than any charge Colton was facing. After Boyd was arrested, everything began moving faster. The immediate threat had been neutralized, and with Boyd in FBI custody, the security reason for preventing Ruth from meeting Colton no longer held. Finley filed a second request, this time attaching an updated report on Colton's psychological condition and a professional recommendation stating that a meeting with his biological mother was an essential step in the therapeutic process. Perry Walsh supported the request from the FBI side, confirming that security had been secured after Boyd's arrest. The court approved it within 3 days. The meeting was arranged in the special visitation room of the Federal Detention Center in Brooklyn, a room reserved for highly sensitive cases, with soundproof glass that allowed people outside to look in but not hear, surveillance cameras without audio recording, and no glass barrier between the two people inside. For the first time in 30 years, nothing stood between Ruth Brennan and her son. That morning, Colton was brought into the room first. He sat in the chair facing the door, hands resting on the table, back straight, his face calm, with the instinct of a man who had spent his entire life training himself not to reveal any emotion. But Finley stood outside the glass room looking in, and she recognized immediately that the calm was cracking from the inside. Colton's hands on the table clenched, then opened, then clenched again. His jaw was locked so tightly that the muscles at both sides of his temples stood out. His eyes were fixed on the door his mother would walk through, and inside those eyes was everything he had buried for 30 years, rising all at once. Then the door opened. Ruth stepped in. She wore a gray sweater, her hair far grayer than in the only photograph Colton had ever seen, her face carrying the marks of 30 years spent living alone with a pain no one knew about. She stopped at the threshold, looked at her son. The 7-year-old boy she had left behind in Boston was now a 37-year-old man, more than a head taller than she was, broad-shouldered, his hands full of scars, his face sharpened into angles she had only ever seen through stolen newspaper photographs. But the eyes, those brown eyes, they were still the eyes of the child she had sung to every night before everything fell apart. Colton stood, no plan, no intention. His legs rose on their own, as though his body had reacted before his mind had time to take control. Both of them froze. They stood less than 3 steps apart, yet the real distance between them was 30 years. A fake funeral, a witness protection program, a criminal empire, and a lie that had swallowed a child's entire boyhood. Ruth spoke first. "You're grown now." Her voice broke on the second word, not the breaking of someone crying, the breaking of something inside her that had held its shape for 30 years by sheer will, and now, seeing her son, that will was no longer enough. Colton didn't answer. His jaw was rigid. His eyes were red. He looked at the woman standing in front of him and tried to match this face with the scent of orange blossoms and the faint lullaby he wasn't sure had ever been real. Tried to find in the lines of her face some fragment of memory that had survived 30 years of darkness. Then he spoke. His voice was hoarse, trembling, but every word was clear. "Why not once? One call, one letter, any sign at all to let me know you were alive." Ruth didn't look away. She looked straight into her son's eyes, into the pain she knew she had caused, and she didn't hide. "If I had called, they would have found me. And if they had found me, they would have killed both me and you." Silence. "Every day I wanted to call. Every day I picked up the phone and put it back down. Every day for 30 years. Colton said nothing. His jaw clenched so hard that Finley, outside the glass room, could see his body shaking. Then Ruth continued, her voice smaller, as though she were telling something she had kept caged inside her chest for years, and now it was finding its own way out. "I watched you give your graduation speech on YouTube. Someone recorded it on a phone and posted it. You were wearing a dark blue suit. You stood at the podium and said you owed everything to your family." She stopped, swallowed. "I sat in my kitchen in Montana, watching on my old phone, and when you said that line, I turned the video off." Her voice broke completely. "I cried for 2 days. Colton broke. Not cracked. Not fractured. Broke. Control, power, coldness. The untouchable image built over 30 years. All of it collapsed in 3 seconds. He dropped his head to the table, covered his face with both hands, and cried. Not the crying of a 37-year-old man. It was the cry of the 7-year-old boy Patrick Brennan had forbidden to cry in the dark room. The boy who had buried his tears so deep, he thought they had died, now discovering they had only been waiting. Waiting for his mother to come back, Ruth stepped closer. She placed her hand on her son's head. A mother's hand touched the hair of the child she hadn't been allowed to touch for 30 years. She said nothing. She didn't need to. She only stood there, her hand on his head, and let him cry until the 7-year-old part of him was allowed to do the one thing he had never been allowed to do: cry in front of his mother. Outside the glass room, Finley stood still. Tears ran down her cheeks, and she didn't bother wiping them away. Perry Walsh stood beside her, looking down at the floor, both hands in his pockets, silent. No one said anything. No one needed to say anything. Because what was happening in the room behind that sheet of glass wasn't law, wasn't the mafia, wasn't doctor and patient. It was the story of a child finding his mother again, and there wasn't a language in the world large enough for that moment. The trial took place 3 weeks after the mother and son reunion at the John Joseph Moakley Federal Courthouse in Boston, the glass building overlooking the harbor Colton had once controlled every night. The courtroom was packed. Reporters lined up outside because the case had become national news ever since Boyd Hackett had been arrested in Montana with a gun in his trunk and a charge of attempting to murder a federal witness. Prosecutor Grant Mercer sat at the prosecution table, as confident as ever. Dark suit, thick case files, ready for the indictment he had spent 2 years building. He expected Ruth Brennan to be the final bullet fired straight at Colton. He was wrong. Ruth stepped onto the witness stand in a simple outfit, her gray hair neatly combed, both hands resting on the edge of the stand, and began to speak. She spoke in an even voice, slow and clear, the voice of someone who had waited 30 years to say these words. She said that 30 years earlier, she had contacted the FBI because her husband was turning their 5-year-old son into something no child deserved to become. She told them about the 2 years she spent gathering evidence inside her husband's organization, about the fear each night as she lay beside Patrick knowing that if he found out, she wouldn't live until morning. She told them about the sealed trial, about Witsec, about 30 years living under another name in a town where no one knew who she was. Then she told them about the structure of the Brennan organization, not the structure Mercer had presented with Colton at the center, but the real structure. She explained the historical hierarchy of the organization, detailing how Patrick's old protocols designed a figurehead boss to absorb legal blame, a structural vulnerability that perfectly matched the newly uncovered federal data, proving that Boyd Hackett had secretly weaponized this exact mechanism to run the violent operations and new routes over the past 10 years. Colton was the face. Boyd was the brain. Mercer objected immediately. But the judge allowed Ruth to continue, because her testimony was supported by physical evidence the FBI had obtained from Boyd's computer and phone after his arrest in Montana. The data showed that Boyd had operated at least 7 networks that the indictment had been placing on Colton's head, including private accounts, direct communications with partners, and orders Colton had never approved. The picture changed, not completely. Colton was still guilty. He had still led the organization, still benefited, still known. But his role in the machinery of violence was far smaller than what Mercer had accused him of, and Boyd's existence as a hidden brain changed the entire structure of the case. After Ruth, Finley was called to the stand as an expert witness. She presented the 23-page clinical report she had spent weeks writing, based on dozens of direct therapy sessions, detention center medical records, and documentary evidence of Colton's childhood. She described complex PTSD, reactive attachment disorder, and explained in language the 12 members of the jury could understand that Colton's extreme behavior wasn't his nature, but the direct, scientifically grounded result of prolonged, violent psychological conditioning that had begun when he was 5 years old. She didn't defend him. She didn't say he was innocent. She told the truth. Colton Brennan was the product of generational violence, and to understand his crimes, one had to understand the origin that had created him. When Finley finished speaking, the courtroom went silent. Then one member of the jury looked toward Colton, and she saw something no indictment had described. Colton was crying. Not loudly. Tears slid down his face, and he didn't wipe them away, his eyes fixed on his mother sitting in the witness row, and on the face all of Boston had once feared. There was only the exhaustion of a man who had carried his burden for too long. The jury saw a crime boss cry as he listened to his mother speak, and that image weighed more heavily than any indictment. 2 weeks later, the plea agreement was finalized. Colton pleaded guilty to money laundering and financial fraud charges, the most serious charges, including extortion and conspiracy under the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, were reduced or dismissed, thanks to evidence showing that Boyd was the principal mastermind behind the violent side of the operation. Combined with the psychological evaluation, the extraordinary circumstances, and Ruth's cooperation, Colton received 5 years in federal prison with mandatory psychological treatment instead of the 25 years Mercer had wanted. Warren Doyle, having chosen his nephew's side over the organization's survival, quietly accepted a probation plea for his past silence, his health fading but his conscience finally clear. Not freedom, but a chance to live again. After the verdict, Colton was transferred to the federal prison in Danbury, Connecticut, a medium-security facility for nonviolent federal inmates, about an hour and a half by car from Brooklyn. In the first days, he sat in his new cell and realized that, for the first time in his life, he didn't need to control anything. No ports, no routes, no partners, no enemies. Only 4 walls, a weekly therapy schedule, and the emptiness inside him that he had spent 30 years running from. Now, with nowhere left to hide, he began real therapy. Not the kind he had been forced into during those first sessions with Finley. The kind where he sat down by choice, opened his mouth by choice, and chose to look at the things he had buried since he was a boy in the dark room. The new doctor wasn't Finley, but a middle-aged psychologist at the prison who specialized in childhood trauma, and Colton didn't try to manipulate him. He spoke. The man listened. And slowly, piece by piece, Colton began learning how to name the things inside him that his father had taught him to bury: fear, loneliness, anger, and the longing for his mother that he had turned into hatred, because hatred was easier to survive than missing someone. Ruth came to visit every month. Each time she sat down in the chair across from him in the visitation room, Colton looked at her as though he were trying to carve every line of her face into the place where, 30 years earlier, there had been only emptiness and the faint scent of orange blossoms. They didn't speak much during the first visits. Sometimes they only sat. Sometimes Ruth told him about Montana, about the lavender garden, about the children at the library she read stories to. Sometimes Colton asked small questions, the kind only a child asks his mother: what she liked to eat, whether she slept well, whether she was afraid of thunder. The questions of the 7-year-old boy were slowly filling 30 years of absence, one small piece at a time. For the first time in his life, Colton Brennan had a mother, not a memory, not a faint lullaby. A real person, sitting in front of him, gray-haired, wet-eyed, holding his hand across the visitation table. Meanwhile, Finley made the hardest decision of her career. She submitted her resignation from her position as a psychologist in the federal prison system, not because she wanted to leave, but because she couldn't be Colton Brennan's doctor and love him at the same time, and she had already chosen. The final boundary she kept wasn't the boundary stopping her from loving him, but the ethical boundary of her profession, the one that required her to step away, so that love wouldn't be stained by the power relationship between doctor and patient. She moved into a research position in Columbia's clinical psychology department, writing a dissertation on the psychological effects of generational violence in organized crime. Inspired by Colton, but using no real name, no identifying details. The first time she visited Colton as a private person was on a Saturday afternoon in October. The regular visitation room, no file in her hands, no notebook, no metal table bolted to the floor, only a plastic table, 2 chairs, and autumn sunlight falling through the narrow window. Colton watched her walk in and knew at once that something was different, not in her clothes or her hair, in her eyes. For the first time, she looked at him without the professional glass standing between them. "You're not my doctor anymore," he said. Not a question. "No." "Then what are you?" Finley looked at him. Looked at the man who had told her about the boy in the dark room, the man she had sat beside when he broke, the man she had risked her career and her safety to protect. Someone who wants to be here. Silence. Autumn sunlight fell across the table at an angle. Then Colton reached across the plastic tabletop, slowly, as though he had never done this before and wasn't sure he knew how. His fingers touched hers, lightly, not holding, only touching. The first time they had ever touched each other, not in a therapy room, not in crisis, not in fear, in peace. The kind of peace they had both spent their lives searching for without knowing what it looked like until this moment. 5 years passed. Autumn came to Connecticut, maple leaves turning a brilliant gold along the road leading to the federal prison in Danbury. And that morning, two women stood outside the gate before the sun had fully risen. Ruth Calloway, or Ruth Brennan, because she had taken back her real name 2 years earlier when she officially left the Witness Protection Program, stood on the left side of the gate, her hair grayer than the last time she had seen her son in the visitation room, but her eyes brighter. She had opened a small flower shop in the town of Litchfield, Connecticut, 40 minutes by car from the prison, close enough to visit her son every week, and far enough to build a new life on the foundation she had thought, 35 years earlier, was lost forever. The flower shop was called Orange Blossom, and she never explained to customers why she had chosen that name. Finley stood on the right, her hair longer than it had been on the first day. She stepped into the therapy room at the Brooklyn Detention Center, wearing the old coat she had owned since her days as a graduate student at Columbia. She had finished her dissertation, published it in a leading clinical psychology journal, and now taught part-time at Columbia while seeing private patients. The fourth-floor walk-up apartment in Flatbush was still her home, but now there were photographs on the wall. One photograph of her father, which she had finally become strong enough to hang up, and one photograph taken secretly through the glass of the visitation room, a photograph Perry Walsh had taken for her without her knowing until he mailed it to her with the note, "You deserve to have this." In the photograph, Colton and Finley sat across from each other at the plastic table, their fingers lightly touching, autumn sunlight falling through the narrow window. Finley's eyes were wet as she stood in front of the prison gate that morning. Not because she was sad, because 5 years was a very long time to wait, and she had waited every day without missing a single one. Once a week, she drove from Brooklyn to Danbury. Each time, she sat across from him at the plastic table and talked about the small things they were both learning to cherish. She told him about that day's lecture. He told her about the book he was reading, and Ruth told them what new variety of lavender she had planted in the garden behind the flower shop. Ordinary conversations between people who were not ordinary, and that very ordinariness healed them both more than any therapy session ever could. Then, the prison gate opened. Colton stepped out. White t-shirt, jeans, no suit, no cufflinks, no entourage, no black car, no one lowering their head as he passed. Only a 42-year-old man stepping into the autumn sun with empty hands and eyes, searching for the only two faces in the world he wanted to see. Ruth walked toward him first. She didn't run. She walked slowly, as if she wanted to remember every step, every second, every moment that 35 years earlier she had thought she would never have. She stood in front of her son, tilting her face upward because he was more than a head taller than she was, and placed both hands on either side of his face, the way she had done when he was so small she had to kneel to meet his eyes. "I'm proud of you." Not proud because he had been a boss. Not proud because he was strong. Proud because he had chosen to stop. Proud because he had chosen healing instead of continuing to destroy. Proud because the boy she had tried to save 35 years earlier had finally saved himself. Colton hugged his mother, for the first time since he was 7, held her tightly, held her for a long time, held her long enough for 35 years of emptiness to shrink into the space between two hearts beating close together. Then he let his mother go and looked toward Finley. She stood there, didn't step forward, didn't say anything, just stood there and looked at him with wet eyes. The same eyes he had first seen across the metal table in the therapy room at the Brooklyn Detention Center when she said, "Being afraid of you wouldn't help me treat you." The eyes that had never looked away since that day. "You waited," he said. Not a question, a recognition. Just like the first time he had said, "You're not afraid of me," in the therapy room. "I told you," Finley answered, her voice trembling softly, but her eyes never leaving him. "I'll be here." Colton stepped toward her and pulled her into his arms, held her tightly, not the embrace of a boss, not the embrace of a patient, The embrace of a man who, for the first time in 42 years on this earth, felt safe. Safe not because he had guns, money, power, or people who feared him. Safe because someone had stayed. His mother stayed. Finley stayed. And for the first time, he allowed himself to believe that he deserved to stay with them. A criminal empire took 30 years to build, but it only took two women, a mother who sacrificed everything to save her son, and a doctor who refused to give up on the patient no one else wanted to touch, to pull one man out of the darkness he had believed was home. This story isn't about the mafia. It isn't about crime or power or money. This story is about the simplest and hardest thing in the world: staying. Staying with someone when everyone else leaves. Staying when staying means loss. Staying when no one is required to stay. In real life, we don't need to destroy an empire in order to heal. Sometimes we only need one person who sees our pain and doesn't look away. One person who sits beside us at 3 o'clock in the morning when everything is at its darkest. One person who says, "I'll be here," and truly keeps that promise. If this story touched you, if there was any moment that made your heart feel a little heavier or your eyes sting a little more, please press the like button so more people can hear this story. Share it with someone you love. And if you haven't subscribed to our channel yet, please subscribe now to listen to more compelling stories every day. We'd truly love to know how this story made you feel. Have you ever met someone who saw the real person inside you, when the whole world only saw the outside? Have you ever stayed for someone even when every reason told you that you should leave? Share your story in the comments. We read every line and always want to hear the feelings that come from deep within your hearts. We wish everyone watching this video very good health, a joyful life, and peace in every day. Thank you for being here with us. Goodbye, and we'll see you in the next video.